Welcome to the Arms Control Primer, a podcast by the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I am your host, Alex Bollfrass, the head of strategy, technology, and arms control, based in Berlin. On each episode, we welcome the world's leading experts in arms control to share their knowledge and assessments on the most critical issues. Whether you are new to the topic or need a refresher, please join us in our exploration of the nuclear past, present, and future. In this season, we examine the histories and policies of countries that may have had nuclear weapons ambitions or even nuclear arsenals, and gave them up. We search for lessons for non-proliferation, arms control, and disarmament. I hope it helps you better know a non-nuke.
From a technical disarmament perspective, this was quite successful. You have to think that back then, it was actually the United States providing economic and technical assistance to states that just minutes ago had been sworn enemy of the United States. So it is a pretty remarkable effort that the United States undertook there in Belarus.
Even though Belarusian President Lukashenko claims that Belarus can decide now and make its own decision about using nuclear weapons, it is very clear that it is Russia that has operational control and decision-making. Even from the satellite imagery that is available, it is clear that there will be the presence of the Russian military personnel, and some is already there.
Following the Soviet Union's collapse, Belarus, alongside Ukraine and Kazakhstan, signed the Budapest Memorandum, committing all three countries to relinquish the Soviet nuclear weapons to Russia in exchange for promises of protection. By November 1996, Belarus had completed the transfer of Soviet warheads to Russia, but not even a decade later, nuclear weapons are back on the agenda. Belarus has overturned its status as a nuclear-free country, and Russian tactical nuclear weapons may already be stationed in Belarus. Elena Sokova and Dr. Alexander Sorg are with us to unpack this nuclear tale.
My name is Elena Sokova. I'm the executive director of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. I worked in non-proliferation arms control disarmament sphere for probably the majority of my career. First, starting with the, at that time, Soviet Union, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Incidentally, I also participated in START 1 negotiations, which is relevant to the discussion of what we're going to have today, because at some point, Belarus also became a part of the START 1 treaty. But for the most part of my career, I worked as a researcher at the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies in Monterey, California. And my focus was from the very start on the former Soviet Union states, their non-proliferation policies, primarily in the nuclear field. So I've covered quite a bit in terms of non-proliferation, arms control, and nuclear security issues. Belarus was part of the Soviet Union, and they played a very important part of the Soviet nuclear weapons shield. As a western part of the Soviet Union, it covered the territories that were adjacent to Eastern Europe, and it played both the role of the stationing of the strategic nuclear weapons on its territory, but also quite a large number of tactical or non-strategic nuclear weapons that would have been easier to use for hitting targets in Western Europe, for example. Interestingly enough, at some point, it also had intermediate range nuclear weapons. But as the Soviet Union and the US agreed on eliminating intermediate nuclear forces in 1987, by the time the Soviet Union collapsed by 1991, all of them have already been eliminated. And when the Soviet Union ceased to exist, Belarus had on its territory the remaining nuclear weapons, including strategic nuclear weapons and tactical nuclear weapons. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, we had 4 nuclear states with nuclear weapons on their territories. Russia itself, but also Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. Compared to Ukraine and Kazakhstan, Belarus had a somewhat smaller arsenal, but nonetheless quite significant. Among the strategic nuclear weapons that had intercontinental ballistic missiles, 81 road mobile SS-25 ICBMs. And they were strategic nuclear delivery systems and capable of striking the United States. Belarus also had non-strategic nuclear weapons. It's unknown the exact number of how many were on the Belarusian territory. There are some estimates put it at 700, some at over 1,000 tactical nuclear weapons. There were different ones, from artillery shells to aerial bombs to other battlefield warheads. But nonetheless, there was quite a significant arsenal of technical nuclear weapons. It is important to note that even though these weapons were stationed on Belarusian territory, it's not like the Belarusian Republic itself had an ability to make decisions about their use.
I'm Alexander Sorg. I'm a postdoc at the Hertie School in Berlin. I focused on various issues of nuclear weapons, nuclear security in my career, and that ranges from forecasting the risk of nuclear use to public opinion surveys on nuclear weapons, nuclear umbrellas. And in that work, I've also delved into the case of Belarus, where Russia now deploys nuclear weapons. You can only talk about an independent nuclear policy of Belarus after it actually becomes an independent country. The most interesting part of history here probably relates to the period just around the demise of the Soviet Union, because that's when suddenly you have many different independent countries which used to be part of this nuclear empire, and they end up with all sorts of nuclear weapons infrastructure on their territories. To give a brief overview of what the Soviet nuclear weapons enterprise actually is, for the most part, the largest share of its nuclear infrastructure is actually on the territory what becomes later Russia. So the largest share of Soviet nuclear armaments are in Russia, the nuclear warheads. The nuclear weapon design sites are in Russia, all types of facilities involved in plutonium production, uranium enrichment, the final assembly of nuclear weapons, that's all in the territory that becomes Russia when the Soviet Union ceases to exist. But for example, if we talk about the major share of nuclear armaments, the Soviet Union at that time possessed around 30,000 nuclear warheads. Even if we're just talking about a smaller share of these 30,000, that's still a lot of nuclear warheads that are dispersed around the whole of the Soviet Union. And so what you end up with in the late 1980s, beginning of the 1990s, is that all sorts of smaller parts of the nuclear weapons enterprise of the Soviet Union are in republics that then become independent states, and most urgently the cases of Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. Among the three major problems, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus is the quote-unquote smallest problem, but Belarus does host is some warning radars, because of course, warning radars, part of the larger nuclear weapons infrastructure, such warning radars you want to have on the periphery and not central inside your country. And so at that point, the Soviet Union has these warning radars in places such as Belarus, Estonia, Ukraine as well. Belarus also supplies a lot of advanced computing and electronics to the Soviet nuclear weapons program. And then the last major concern is that Belarus also hosts highly enriched uranium. So at the time of the Soviet Union, Belarus doesn't have a civilian nuclear power program, but it does have a nuclear research reactor and an experimental reactor on its territory, as it's still part of the Soviet Union. And there, over 300 kilo of highly enriched uranium are held. Once the Soviet Union ceases to exist, you have strategic warheads in Belarus, you have hundreds of tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus, and you have 300 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. That's not a full nuclear weapons program yet, but it's of course already much further than any other state at that point that's not a nuclear weapons state. This causes quite a bit of concern in the international community. And this leads us to the whole history of the nuclear disarmament, the Budapest Memorandum, and so on, in which Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus then disarm and become non-nuclear weapon states.
Belarus signed the Budapest Memorandum in December 1994. relinquishing nuclear missiles to Russia. Our guests share their perspective on the country's disarmament.
The road to the Budapest Memorandum had several steps. First, we'll start with the decision by Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and Kazakhstan in Belarus to dissolve the Soviet Union. And literally, almost right after that, the question came up about the nuclear arsenal and control over it. And in December 1991, almost immediately after Belarus Pushcha, there was the Alma-Ata Declaration and Protocol that created these commonwealths of independent states, where most of the former Soviet republics, with the exception of the Baltics and Georgia, were part of that commonwealth. And at that time, there was also a decision and declaration that Russia will inherit the nuclear arsenal and the other countries would commit to join NPT as non-nuclear weapon states and transfer nuclear weapons to the Russian territory. In case of Belarus, that was probably the most easy decision. And actually, Belarus was eager to get rid of the Soviet nuclear weapons. There probably have been several reasons for that. One is Belarus was probably the most affected by Chernobyl because of the wind direction and the fallout of the radiation after Chernobyl accident. And second, I think Belarus also understood at that time that being the first one neighboring Western countries of the part of the Soviet Union, it also remained a target for attack or retaliatory actions. So in this sense, Belarus was really happy to get rid of these weapons. And in fact, it was the first one to transfer both the tactical nuclear weapons. Already by July 1992, all tactical nuclear weapons were transferred to Russia, and strategic weapons by the end of 1994. Another important point is the Lisbon Protocol to Start One Treaty, which was signed on May 23rd, 1992. It codified Belarus, Kazakhstan, Russia, and Ukraine as parties to the 1991 Start One Treaty. They became successors to the Soviet Union to implement collectively the reductions in the terms of the agreement that was originally negotiated between the Soviet Union and the US. And that Lisbon Protocol also had the commitment by all three, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, to join the NPT. And now to the Budapest Memorandum, which actually three different memoranda, one with each of these former republics, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. But the other signatory parties are the United States, the UK, and the Russian Federation. And as we all know, that it contains security assurances in exchange for these countries giving up nuclear weapons and joining the NPT. And the other point is that in the case of all three states that inherited some nuclear weapons deployed on their territory, these were Soviet arsenals deployed in this republic. And most importantly, they didn't have the production or capability to maintain these nuclear weapons. In the case of Belarus, they transferred their nuclear weapons, as I said, early on, and were the first one to complete the removal of Soviet nuclear weapons from their territory back to Russia. And also Belarus was the first one actually acceding to the NPT in July 22nd, 1993. Is non-nuclear weapon state. If you look at the Budapest Memorandum, it's December 5th, 1994. It put into its constitution that was adopted in 1994 that Belarus was a nuclear-free and seeking a neutral status state, which was interesting language. It called it nuclear-free zone, which doesn't mention nuclear weapons, but it implies nuclear weapons-free zone as well.
If we talk about this history of disarmament of the successor states to the Soviet Union, it's also quite important to note that at no time did the non-Russian republics have operational control or the ability to launch the nuclear weapons on their territory. That doesn't mean that it's not a major concern, but it's not like they were in full control of the nuclear weapons or they had a fully fledged nuclear weapons program on their territory and then they give it up. So it's something in between. Belarus actually starts pretty quickly on its path to independent statehood to have this intention of becoming a nuclear-free state. In the years of becoming an independent state, Belarus quickly says, okay, we're going to be a non-nuclear state. We agree to join the NPT, and it also becomes part of the cooperative threat reduction program. So the program is essentially a US Congress-initiated bipartisan program where there's material assistance given to Belarus, Kazakhstan, Russia, and Ukraine in order to secure all sorts of nuclear materials and nuclear weapons in these states. The fear at the time is, of course, these states could try to build up their own nuclear weapons program, and then you have all of a sudden many more nuclear weapon states in the world. The other fear is that these weapons and this highly enriched uranium, the nuclear materials, this whole infrastructure could get into the hands of non-state actors or criminals, and that would cause serious problems as well. So you have the cooperative threat reduction program initiated by the US Congress in 1992, which gives a lot of money and technical assistance to the former Soviet states and says, look, we want you to help to get all of this material back to Russia or to dismantle it, to get rid of it. And all of that is accompanied politically by the negotiations and the eventual signing of the Budapest Memorandum in 1994. Because Budapest Memorandum really has this idea of you get security in exchange for giving up any ambitions to become a nuclear weapon state.
In 2024, military officials of Belarus announced the deployment of Russian non-strategic nuclear weapons on their territory. Elena Sokova and Alexander Sorg discussed the strategic implications and the reasoning behind this decision.
What do we know about nuclear weapons in Belarus currently? At least two types of delivery systems have been transferred or modified in case of aircraft to Belarus. These are Iskander-M, short-range ballistic missiles, which can be equipped with nuclear warheads, and a number of the modified Su-25 aircraft that can carry airdropped nuclear bombs. So these are tactical nuclear weapon systems. What we also know possibly is the location of the stationing of these systems. This was done using the open source information, satellite imagery, and we have some idea of where both the Iskanders or the aircraft are located. We also know from the open source analysis the possible location of a nuclear warhead storage site. We don't know whether the nuclear warheads have already been transferred and placed there. There are various estimates that come from assessments by open source information, some comments coming from government experts, particularly in Western countries. We don't have verified information about whether they have been transferred and how many. Some estimates suggest that there may be 20 to 50 nuclear warheads that have already been transferred to Belarus, but we still don't have the confirmation or verification of that. There are plans, and they have been announced by Putin and by Lukashenko, about stationing some Oreshnik missiles. These are the missiles that made the news more recently when these new missiles were announced by Russia, but also because they were tested. There have been only two launches of these systems, of these missiles. Both were made from the territory of Russia and hit Ukraine. This was more like in-field testing of these missiles. What we do know is that these are intermediate range ballistic missiles, or considered potentially hypersonic ballistic missiles. They're nuclear capable, but what we don't know first, how many of them have been produced in Russia. In December 2025, there was a TV footage coming from Russia and Belarus about some of the Oreshniks coming to Belarus. It was not clear, though, whether they were there for some maneuvering, so for exercise, or they were on the mission to be permanently staged in Belarus. In any case, the potential site for their stationing is somewhere 5 kilometers from the Russian territory. So it doesn't make much of a difference in terms of whether it's in Russia or in Belarus. But we also don't know whether these maneuvers that were in December were indeed the movement of these missiles to Belarus. Regardless of whether they are there or not, placement them in the European part of Russia or in Belarus is opening a completely new chapter when it comes to the whole range of nuclear weapons delivery systems. These are intermediate range missiles. And these are the missiles that were eliminated after the 1987 INF Treaty. And what that development brings to the table is, again, the threat of deployment of intermediate range missiles in Europe and the potential for an arms race from both sides to deploy them in Europe.
Let's get into what broad developments that have helped the deployments to come about. The first one probably dates back to the late 1990s, and that is the Union State Framework. Essentially, it is a supranational institution in which Russia and Belarus would cooperate on a whole spectrum of issues, from economic to legal to military. It was supposed to lead to a common constitution, monetary union, and so on. Many of these projects actually never came about. Lukashenko was quite supportive of the framework in the 1990s, also when Putin wasn't in power yet, because Lukashenko allegedly had some aspiration to potentially move out of the role of the dictator of Belarus to lead a unified Belarusian Russian state. And so at the beginning of this whole process of the Union State negotiation process, he was quite supportive. And then he became much more concerned with the implications of losing sovereignty, of losing power. All of these negotiations and the implementation of some of the projects underneath the framework of the Union State come to a halt until the late 2010s. And why the late 2010s? Well, that's the second broader development, and that is that Belarus becomes increasingly dependent on Russia. Lukashenko, for the longest time, has always tried to maintain ties to the West, especially the European Union and Russia, and shift back and forth between these two actors, trying to reap the most benefits from either relationship. But then these massive protests come about in 2020. The European Union implements sanctions that have quite a bit of an effect. The relationship deteriorates a lot, and Lukashenko becomes more and more dependent on Russia as a fact, but also, I think, dependent in the sense that he thinks Russia is the one that can guarantee for my security, that can guarantee for my regime to survive. And so I need to align myself with Russia more so than I've done in the past. And then the third development here is the relationship between Russia and the West, which severely deteriorates after the Crimea annexation, and of course, even more so once Russia launches a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And this is accompanied by nuclear signaling on Russia's part, constant nuclear threats, and the deployment of nuclear weapons to a neighboring state might just be part of that.
Despite the claims by the Belarusian president Lukashenko that Belarus now can make decisions and fire nuclear weapons if it chooses to do so, it is clear that the operational control and decision-making remains with Moscow. And to a certain degree, the whole arrangement with Belarus and placing Russian weapons on its territory is mirroring NATO nuclear sharing arrangements. And the operational and decision-making control remains with Russia. But there are still quite a number of implications of placing nuclear weapons on the Belarusian territory. First of all, placing tactical nuclear weapons and delivery systems obviously shortens the time for attacking the NATO states or neighboring states. With respect to strategic nuclear weapons, there is not much difference, and Belarus doesn't have them at the moment. beyond stationing the weapons closer to potential targets in NATO Europe countries, there is not much advantage of doing it because Russia already has capabilities and most of its system can already reach the Western countries. It's just shortening the flight time, for example. The other thing that it does, it actually makes Belarus more vulnerable to a potential retaliation if some of these nuclear weapons are launched from the Belarusian territory. God forbid, but that's the considerations that go into the planning and stationing and thinking about it. Then it will be Belarus territory rather than Russian territory that will be hit. So it's a double-edged sword for Lukashenko in this respect.
It's a somewhat open question why Russia deploys nuclear weapons to Belarus. The simplest idea would be it might just be another nuclear signal. It's Russia saying, look, we expand the role of nuclear weapons in all sorts of ways, and you better watch out. And our deployment to Belarus is one of these ways. It could be about the defense of the Belarusian regime. Lukashenko might be quite afraid that the West will support opposition forces in Belarus, and the West or NATO or European countries might think twice about supporting opposition forces in a state that holds nuclear weapons, just because of the fact that if there is quote unquote chaos in that state, then you have a loose nuke situation. And it also gives Russia another reason to intervene quickly. We need to secure our nuclear weapons, and that is why we need to now intervene in Belarus. Related to that, it could be the control of Belarus. You place your military there, you establish ever closer connections between Russia and Belarus, and Russia might just be interested to, through also military means, control Belarus even further. And then there's two last ideas that have been swirling around, and that is that it could be an asset in future arms control negotiations. Russia is not entirely happy, let's put it mildly, with the nuclear sharing infrastructure that NATO has established in Europe. And so we could say in some future scenario, we will get rid of the nuclear weapons in Belarus and you get rid of the nuclear weapons in state X and Y. And then lastly, it could also be about if you actually use the nuclear weapons through Belarusian military personnel uses the nuclear weapons that you release to them, then this might shift the blame somewhat. It now includes Belarus and Russia, and it might make NATO calculations a bit more complicated. Because some states could be incentivized to say, shouldn't we focus the retaliation on Belarus? Because this might be somewhat less escalatory than if we now focus all of the retaliation and really go hard against Russia. And for example, after a demonstrated use of nuclear weapons that occurs from Belarusian territory and that is carried out by Belarusian military.
As our episode comes to a close, our guests reflect on the lessons of this unusual nuclear case.
What can we learn from the Belarusian case? Well, first and foremost, that arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation commitments are reversible. And what the geopolitics change, strategic decisions change, insecurities, and so forth. But what it does probably tell us that long-term arms control stability depends on sustained geopolitical cooperation and engagement, and not just initial agreements. We know that the end of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, we saw many of the arms control treaties, disarmament treaties put in place. But at a certain point, we became complacent that much more could have been done. And we should have continued to engage on these issues rather than more or less think that the mission is almost accomplished and not pursue it more actively and collectively. Most important lesson from the Budapest Memorandum and how it was designed and the specific status of it. First and foremost, political commitments are not legally binding commitments. Security assurances are not the same as security guarantees. If you don't have that binding force and some enforcement of it, I'm not suggesting that political commitments are not important and don't have their own value. But if we do want treaties and agreements to have more value and have some bite and enforcement behind that. This should be legally binding, fully through all the procedures, negotiated, ratified agreements. After Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea and then the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, the credibility of such assurances, the future of Budapest Memorandum-like agreements obviously have been questioned and will continue to be questioned. That is an important lesson for potentially other countries that we would at certain point want to disarm, say, North Korea, what kind of lessons they would derive from that. Then I would also note the nuclear sharing. At certain point, the US and the European countries were even discussing possibility of completely closing down of the US bases and stationing of nuclear weapons on the European territory. But it hasn't been completed. That was significantly reduced after the end of the Cold War. But it also, if somebody using certain arrangements, and there is a precedent, most likely it would also be used by some others when their security circumstances change and they would want to say why one side can do it and we cannot do it. Obviously, there was a lot of critique towards the deployment of Russian tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. But nonetheless, the Russian Federation, which actually used to criticize NATO specifically for the nuclear sharing arrangement, and particularly within the NPT context and meetings, in the end said, if some others are allowed in using it, why not we follow the suit when it suits our security interest? And finally, with the potential deployment of Oreshnik in Belarus, but also on the Russian territory, we are seeing the deployment of the intermediate range missiles in Europe. And that is a very disturbing development, given this whole class of nuclear weapons has been eliminated at the end of the Cold War. We are facing a potential and real potential of a new nuclear arms race with various strategic intermediate range tactical weapons, exotic weapons, including some of the weapons that the Russian Federation couldn't have been claiming or demonstrating. And we're left without any arms control agreement practically. The last bilateral US-Russian Strategic Arms Control Treaty, New START, has perished to exist. What is extremely important is that if we want to avoid a new arms race, but also in these volatile times, bring back a little bit of stability and predictability, arms control is extremely important. And even discussing potential, we don't need to have the precise parameters of it, but it's important to at least to have a dialogue and have a conversations, listen to each other and concerns, take it seriously rather than the trend that we have been observing is like, okay, doesn't work, throw it out of the window. It is sad to see the whole era of arms control to be collapsing literally as we speak.
The lessons that we can learn from the Belarusian case for arms control and non-proliferation are sort of twofold. The first would concern the disarmament of Belarus after it becomes an independent state. Looking at it from the historical perspective, one can appreciate what a hugely successful effort in denuclearization this whole process around the Budapest Memorandum and the cooperative threat reduction program was in Belarus and in the other Soviet republics, just from a purely technical point of view. If the goal is denuclearization, then to what extent was this achieved? You can say that it has been remarkably successful. For instance, despite hosting nuclear weapons now, I don't think that there's really any indication that Belarus could develop a nuclear weapons program anytime soon. And that, of course, this danger was much more present just after the Cold War. So it's a very successful case of disarmament from the perspective of some of the states themselves. I think less so Belarus, but if you ask Ukrainians, they might think about this quite differently. So I don't want to make a political judgment here, but from a technical disarmament perspective, this was quite successful. You have to think that back then it was actually the United States providing economic and technical assistance to states that just minutes ago had been sworn enemy of the United States. So it is a pretty remarkable effort that the United States undertook there. But the fact that these nuclear weapons and all the nuclear material ended up back safely in Russia from a US national security perspective was, I think, hugely beneficial. So that's the first part of what we can learn for arms control and non-proliferation. The second part would concern the deployments today. And I think there's 3 lessons here. The first one is that precedent matters, at least somewhat. I don't want to claim that Russia would have never deployed nuclear weapons abroad if it wasn't for the US engaging in nuclear sharing, but it's somewhat difficult to criticize something that you're doing yourself. And also this idea that Russia might eventually want to make use of the deployment as bargaining chips goes in the same direction. On the flip side, that's the second lesson here. Russia has long criticized NATO for its nuclear sharing practice, even said that the nuclear sharing would breach the NPT, which I personally believe to be false in any case, but I would suspect that we will hear much less about this now that Russia engages in exactly the same practice. And then lastly, a third point, which is that China here seems to remain relatively committed to its anti-nuclear norms. At least we know that China is largely supportive of Russia. It refrains mostly from criticizing Russia, but it has openly criticized the potential deployment of nuclear weapons in a UN session on exactly that topic. That's a somewhat unusual little twist in their normally quite stable relationship.
Thank you for listening, our guests for speaking, and the European Union Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium for funding this series. Until next time, stay optimistic.